It's time to explore the world according to Glenn. I'm Kevin Jacobsen. Glenn Close is my favorite actress, and this show is all about exploring the career of one of the finest actors of her generation. Each episode, I'll be joined by a guest as we dive into one of Glenn's movies, TV shows, or stage productions, going chronologically through her career, discussing her performance, and assessing the project itself. And today, it's a very special episode where I'll be interviewing Charlie McDowell, the director of Glenn's newest film, The Summer Book. This is a beautiful film based on the classic novel by Tove Jansson, which tells the story of a grandmother, played by Glenn, who takes care of her granddaughter, Sophia, played by Emily Matthews, on her island home in the Gulf of Finland over the course of this beautiful, idyllic summer. She also helps Sophia's father, played by Anders Danielsen Lee, connect with Sophia following the death of Sophia's mother. So it's a lovely story. We get super in depth about the film and about Charlie's experience working with Glenn. So I had a great time with this. I hope you enjoy, and I hope you see it in theaters if you're listening to this episode this week, or eventually it will be obviously streaming at home, but it's a timeless story. So please enjoy.
Eight-time nominee Glenn Close, motherfuckers.
So we have a very special episode of The World According to Glenn today. I have someone who has worked intimately with Glenn Close very recently, the director of such films as The One I Love, The Discovery, Windfall, and now The Summer Book, starring Glenn Close, which is finally arriving in theaters now in the US. Welcome to the show, Charlie McDowell.
Thank you for having me. Very nice to be here.
I am so excited to have you on here. But before we talk about The Summer Book, I just wanted to start kind of how I start every episode with my guests, which is just by asking you to tell me your relationship to Glenn Close overall and what memories you may have of maybe even meeting her for the first time. I mean, I know that, you know, your stepfather, Ted Danson, has worked with her a few times now, so I'm assuming she's been in your orbit. But yeah, what's your relationship and what's your favorite performance from her career, if you have one?
Yeah, so I had actually never met Glenn until this project.
Wow.
I of course have followed her career, was such a huge fan of hers, and then through my stepfather, who had worked with her multiple times, had only heard amazing things, and so she was, I would say she was like very close to me without having experienced her myself, and but was always kind of, I don't know, in my mind I always knew or wanted to work with her. She was someone that I wanted to find a project with her, and I think what I found so interesting about Glenn was she still, even you know, as an older actress, she still experiments and explores, and that is like, it's such a beautiful thing to watch. And then now knowing her so well, it's inspiring as someone. She inspired the entire crew of our movie because she's still so youthful and she still has so much energy and she wants to explore, and I think that's something we should all kind of hold on to, whether you work in film or you work in anything else. The idea of being curious and wanting to kind of continue exploration is a beautiful thing, you know. And so yeah, so I first met Glenn on a Zoom about this project, and I wrote her a long letter explaining why I felt like she was the only person to play this role. And also, I reference in the letter that I felt like she would really connect to this character because I knew that she wasn't in the sort of Hollywood system. She didn't live in LA. She wasn't all consumed by the industry. And I felt like to ask an actress to fly to Helsinki, which is already very far, and then get in a car and drive an hour and a half east towards Russia, and then get on a boat every day for an hour to go to set, that you got to find someone that wants to do that. You got to find someone
Hmm.
that wants to be in nature and have this kind of adventurous, wild experience, and not someone who's like, yeah, I like the part, and oh, here's a check and it fits in my, in my schedule. I'm just going to do it. I wanted someone who really felt like they wanted to be a part of this adventure. And so anyway, we spoke on a Zoom for a couple hours and immediately felt like she was someone that I'd known my whole life. And she just said on the Zoom, she's like, let's do this. I'm excited to do this with you. And I felt incredibly honored and of course terrified. She's a sort of larger than life figure, and so yeah, so that kind of is what kicked off my experience with her. And then I ended up meeting her at this like an awards thing or something, where we got to like actually see each other face to face. And then it wasn't again until she showed up in Finland when we started making the movie. And I would say, I mean, her career is, there's so many brilliant performances. I think for me, the one that I'll reference is The Wife, which is a more recent
Hmm.
film that she did. And the reason that I reference it is I was going through sort of her catalog of movies when I was imagining her for this part. And when I watched The Wife, something that I thought was so brilliant was you have this person going through this internal struggle, and all of it is on the face. All of it is on the face, and then what's inside. Very little dialogue about what her experience is and what she's going through emotionally. And that's a really hard thing to do as an actor. It's so much easier to rely on dialogue, even if it's a sort of the subtext of the scene is something else. Through dialogue, it's much easier to convey these ideas, whereas to sort of have this internal performance and this like stoicism that she had in that part, that felt weirdly very similar to this part that I was asking her to play, which is very little dialogue, a lot of these sort of meditative scenes through just holding and observing on character, instead of a more traditional narrative scene where you get to know a character, and so for me, The Wife was, I would say, of all of her films, that was the one for this particular role that I was the most impacted by, because that's what made me go, okay, this is the person. This is the person to play this part.
Yeah, I think you had a lot of smart instincts there because she also, she loves her country life with her family as well.
Exactly.
And you could tell how much she loves, her daughter and,
Yeah.
her whole family. And
Yeah.
I could definitely see all the connecting parts there. But like for me, I've talked about this a little on my episode about Sarah Plain and Tall. That was a movie that I watched like with my grandmother when I was little, and Glenn's character in that on this rewatch I recently did really reminded me so much of my grandmother and her spirit, and just how she made people feel loved and appreciated, kind of like Sarah does in that movie. And so watching the Summer Book really kind of gave me a lot of those same feelings too, because I spent a lot of time, a lot of my summers with my grandparents, and they basically like babysat me for 2 months. And so I remember doing a lot of things outside with them and playing in nature and coming up with stories, and so many of these things that are actually found in your film, which
Yeah.
really took me to that place where like there were no screens, and like spending all that time outside. And there is a certain timelessness I found to your film. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but there aren't that many indicators of this taking place at like a set period of
Yeah,
time.
there's no, I mean, there's
Yeah.
There's no indicators except for, as a sort of process of making the film, I
Mhm.
had rules of, okay, it takes place in this time period, but we never explain that or sort of show it. And that comes from this sort of timelessness of certainly Nordic summer culture, which is, I mean, you can go to a summer house now and it is the exact same as it was 50 years ago. There's no difference. And that's because I think they really do turn off screens. They really do like not use modern technology, spend time with family. And so that's really what I wanted this film to be about. And so there was a early on in the edit, I put Finland 1972 because that's when the book was written. And that lasted 2 days and I kept getting annoyed by it. I was like, why do I need to tell people this?
Right.
And then when I took it away, I was like, oh yeah, okay, this is, whether people want to think it's a modern day story or a story from 1970, it doesn't matter. It's the same story, and also it should be the same effect that I'm hoping to achieve, which is creating this little bubble where you as an audience get to be transported to a beautiful meditative place for 90 minutes in this very fast-paced digital world that we live in, where we're expected to have a new idea and a new image every 3 seconds, and I'm a part of it. I doom scroll all the time, but that terrifies me, and it terrifies me even more. I have a 7-month old daughter. It terrifies me even more for her future. And so for me, what really became the like, I need to make this film was I wanted a film that slows people down. I wanted a film that allows exactly what you said earlier. It allows you to bring the history and the makeup of who you are as a person into the film. And it's okay if your mind drifts off and you're almost not paying attention to a scene. That's okay, because I think you should feel connected to these characters in a way that you're putting your own grandparents into the equation, or you're putting yourself into the experience. And I think because the movie sort of has these three different generations, everyone has some sort of connection to it, whether it's the exploration of a young person, or it's the midlife time in someone's life where it's hard and you don't know how to move forward, or it's the end of someone's life when you're sort of looking back and making sure that you had all the experiences that you wanted to, and that you sort of passed down that knowledge to the younger generations. Like, these are all really kind of beautiful ideas and moments. And so yeah, I think the main purpose for me of this film is to allow people to kind of disappear into a simpler time that we're not accustomed to anymore. And I would say it only gets worse every year. It only gets faster every year. And so yeah, this is my my anti AI technology, whatever. And it's
Mhm.
my pro nature, it's my pro nature film. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I'm very proud of the movie because of that. I think it's also the biggest challenge of the movie is like, how do you get people to want to do that? Or how do you get people to go to a theater to have that experience when they're not accustomed to it anymore? Or it might be easier to live in the anxiety of social media and these ideas, but I'm allowing people to have an alternative. Is the hope.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I felt. And I find there's so many lovely little scenes. I mean, it starts with this calm, like melting ice in the lake and the sort of rhythms of the sea that you're hearing that starts out the film. But then there's also this beautiful, I thought, early morning scene too, where grandmother crawls out of bed and goes outside to just listen to the chirps of the birds and is just closing her eyes and hearing the nature all around her. And it's so calming. And it made me think of how so few films these days really allow us moments like that to just
Yeah.
rest. And then,
Yeah.
Sophia comes out and joins her, and grandmother just says she's listening. That's all.
Yeah.
That's she just leaves it at that. And it's there's beautiful look of serenity on her face too. Just on a thematic level, I'm curious if you could speak to those scenes of quiet and the importance of getting those right, and even like how scripted or improvised some of those were, because they feel very naturalistic just watching them.
Yeah, I mean, that scene in particular was scripted,
Mm-hmm.
but I would say that the island, getting to the island and spending time there, I stayed on the island for 3 weeks with my cinematographer Sturla before we started shooting, and I would say that the entire visual language of the film was discovered in those 3 weeks, and it came from observation. It came from doing exactly what happened in that scene, which is Sterla and I would sit there in silence for sometimes 2 hours. Like we weren't even talking about shots. We were sitting there watching, and all of a sudden you'd see, the tide come up and down, and you started to kind of get into the rhythm of the water going up and down. And at one point, one of us said, "Oh, that feels like a heartbeat. That feels like the heartbeat of the island is actually like breathing." And then, that created an idea that goes into the film. And I would say there was a lot of those moments just in the 3 weeks there before. There was moments of like a storm would come through and take out, an entire area of plants and flowers. And then 2 days later, you had completely different colors, these different colors that sort of were birthed from this destruction that came through. And I think at a certain point, we made this connection. And this is especially true of the northern countries where you do have extreme weather. But we made this connection of the summer, the beginning of the summer to the end when it's autumn in this particular area feels like the experience of someone's entire life and what they go through. So you experience, tragedy and death. You experience absolute joy. You experience boredom. You sort of go through all these experiences. And I think the island does too. It really feels like it's kind of living, breathing, dying, and then just starting that process all over again. And so I would say that, yeah, so much of what you see visually and of course, audibly as well, because you're connecting so much to your senses when you're there. You're like, okay, what is this sound like? What does this look like? What does this feel like? All these things. And I would say so much of it was just revealed by the setting, and I would say slowly made its way into the movie instead of quickly, which would have just been like, oh, that's a cool image. Oh, oh, this is an interesting frame. If we like short side her and we put her on the edge, and I've done that before, but I would say it doesn't, I would say when I'm doing that, I'm probably doing something that feels like a cool shot or something that feels sort of daring, but isn't really. And I would say this movie visually completely came from the island, and it was revealed during the planning. And of course, Sturla is a master, so he's, we're shooting on 60 millimeter film, and it's the process is its own adventure, and he's making it look beautiful. But at the same time, we have 22 hours of sunlight. we have 4 hours of magic hour. Like we were given the tools for this to be a visual piece, and we definitely took advantage of them.
Yeah, it sounds like that slower process is actually kind of in keeping with some of the themes of the film, which is very fitting, But just to before we dig further into any of the themes of the movie, I just wanted to obviously talk about Glenn's performance, which I found amazing and such a treat as a fan of hers, really, to see her like transform in this way and really see her tap into her warmth and also just her generosity as a screen partner, like with Emily Matthews, who plays Sophia. Just curious how much you talked with Glenn ahead of time about the physicality of her performance, because there's so much of that to this, and the labored breathing and the limp and squinting in parts. Like there's a lot going on, but there's also the intimacy of her relationship with Sophia. It's so crucial to make us believe their history.
Yeah, well, it started with when I saw Glenn in person. Glenn has less wrinkles than I do. Like Glenn is like she's youthful, she looks youthful. So when I saw her in person, I was like, Glenn, you're not nearing the end of your life at all. Like you do not look at all like the state of what this sort of character is in. And so she agreed, and so she had worked with this incredible special effects makeup artist named Chloe, and so she said, I think we should bring Chloe into the film because she can do such a kind of subtle job aging me. And of course, as a director, you immediately go to like, oh no, I don't want it to be cartoony. But Glenn was like, no, trust me, she's amazing. It will feel very naturalistic and true to the character. And so we did some tests, and so in the film, Glenn is actually wearing 12 different prosthetic pieces, and it took about almost 3 hours of makeup every day. And that was a big decision to move forward with, but it was one of the most crucial decisions because one, you felt like this character really was this like weathered woman of the island, and you felt like she had been baking under that sun for 40 years and smoking cigarettes and all of these things, and so it was a very kind of crucial part of creating who she was. And I think for Glenn as well, to sort of like become the character, I think it was important to do that. And but of course it makes it more challenging. You're taking 3 hours out of the day and into hair and makeup. And so it started, I would say, with that. And then when we got to the island, Glenn and I just spent time. I think it was one day where I was like, "Hey, can we just walk around the island? Can we just experience it?" And you immediately start to see, okay, oh, I feel a little bit uncomfortable on this surface, or it's steep here. And so I think Glenn got to sort of experience what it felt like to be a person on this island. And then also we both agreed, like, she's been here so many times, we can never have Glenn as the actor feel like she's walking this rock slope for the first time, and so I would say we definitely spent time just kind of experiencing what it was like walking around. And then a lot of my direction and relationship with Glenn through this process was just checking in about where she was as the character in any particular scene. And we really did, I would say, chart this idea of her decline and when that happens, or also just a day of like, her character's feeling sore and her legs hurt, and so she's going to be walking differently than she did the day before, because the day before was quite active and she was following Sophia around and she was crawling and all these things. So I would say we spent a lot of time on the physicality aspect of it. And then you have this sort of master artist who's done it for so long that I think she immediately just instinctually knew who this character was, what she felt like as a sort of physical being. Um, and so I think her instincts were always really spot on. And if they weren't, then it was a very simple like, hey Glenn, I think we've gone too far on this end. I think we need to reel it in. And it got to the point where she and I were so close and connected that it's just a look, and she's like, too much, and I'm like, yeah, and it's just that. And and yeah, so I think I had never directed an actor in such a physical part before, because it's so much, like I was very influenced by like Tarkovsky, where it's just these like observational kind of long shots. And so I really wanted people to just watch her, to just observe her walk. And so that was as important as any dialogue scene for me. And so yeah, I would say that was a big part of our process. And yeah, probably the most discussion we had in terms of performance was the physicality.
Yeah. I have found that she is very sharp and intelligent as an actress, and I think that comes through here very clearly. So like I've been talking with a good friend of mine about like coming of age stories, and she said very wisely, I think, that some of the best coming of age stories are also about the mother or the parental figure, and that
Yeah,
relationship being the core of so many great coming of age stories over the years, like Lady Bird, for example.
yeah,
And I was just thinking about that too here with this, where I feel like it could have been very easy to just completely center this story on Sophia and have the grandmother be just a mentor and just that parental figure, and share those pearls of wisdom, and but not necessarily feel like a fully fleshed out person herself. And I think what you do and what Glenn does too is create a three-dimensional human being, and we have multiple shots of her like alone in nature or alone in her bedroom just sitting with herself, or even reckoning with the end being near for her life, or getting frustrated because she can't remember certain things like core memories from her past. And some of that comes from Jansson's book, of course, but I'm
yeah.
wondering at what point in the process you felt like these sort of parallel journeys of Sophia and grandmother felt like the right balance.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I'm interested in as a filmmaker, and maybe it's the sort of, I don't know, contrarian side, but like if I feel like Hollywood doesn't sort of do well with aging talent.
Yeah.
And as someone who comes from a family, a troupe of actors, essentially, I have my own observations of that because my parents are getting older,
Mhm.
and it's a brutal business in many ways because it is so focused on the shiny thing, and most of the time the shiny thing is the younger thing. And so I think I immediately gravitated towards telling a story of someone aging, someone who's scared of dying, someone who's okay dying, like all of these sort of complex emotions. And that certainly came from in the last, I would say, 5 years, not a family member, but people very close to me dying, and going through that process, and watching them go through the acceptance of the end, and so I really wanted to capture that. That felt like something, and I never once thought about like, is this going to pigeonhole the audience, or like who is the audience? Is this a movie for old people? Is this, I didn't really think about who was the audience, because I felt like it was so important to tell a sort of three-dimensional story about the end, as important as the beginning. And essentially they're the same thing. It's just this circle that continues on, and this story is one tiny little, look and peek into this idea, but it just keeps going, you know, and that's why nature is so beautiful, is that just keeps going, you know. So anyway, so I that's what kind of, besides the fact that you have Glenn Close, who you don't want to make something where you underuse Glenn Close, you know, immediately.
Certainly not.
But at the same time, I think Glenn knew I wasn't going to do that, and it was apparent by the story that Tove Jansson created, is apparent by the script, and so I always wanted to have the balance between the two, and make sure that I was sort of exploring the beginning as much as the end. And so yeah, I mean, I don't know if that completely answers your question, but I would say that it was a very conscious idea to explore aging and death, because I felt like it isn't explored very much, and when it is, I think those films are beautiful, and I think they're very impactful, and I think it gives younger people a connection to the older generation. And I'm certainly someone, I don't have grandparents anymore, but I'm certainly someone, when I was younger, you know, my mom's like, call your grandmother, and at the time it feels like a chore, you know.
Hmm.
And I look back at that and I'm like, God, why was that a chore for me, you know? And I think, like, I wish I had seen this movie as a kid, you know, like I wish I had kind of experienced this, and I probably would have called my grandmother up immediately, you know, and so I think that this film can also kind of inspire younger people and inspire older people to kind of find the connection between cross generations.
Certainly, yes, and it did make me miss my own grandmother, who I lost a few years ago. So yeah, I felt that. And I think, speaking to that exploration, another wonderful scene is when, for Glenn, is when grandmother is revealing to Sophia that she was responsible for making sure that girls could be scouts on the island. And she tells her that she can't do things she used to do anymore. And she's saying, like, day after day, everything is gliding away from me. Like, usually I don't care, but once in a while I do care. And she's frustrated at her mind that's starting to fail her, and saying she doesn't even remember the old times anymore. And I love the touch of adding her heartbeat as Sophia is listening on her chest. And, you know, Sophia asking these kind of a little bit uncomfortable questions about death and whether they'll dig a hole for her. You know, and you're starting to see a little bit of that discomfort from grandmother, and a little bit of fear too, having to talk about these things with Sophia. Because I think, you know, grandmother is a very selfless person, and she does just want what's best for her granddaughter. But there's something about her playing with Sophia too, and like being mischievous, that
Yeah,
is perhaps her way of trying to recapture some of that childlike wonder in her youth, and not really face those more mature facts of, like, not having much time left on the earth. And so all this kind of relates back to how I think, with the editing and the writing and the performances and your direction, there is a kind of a mood to the film that is nostalgic and melancholy at times, but it never becomes like a downer per se, or like
yeah,
death is something that grandmother should fear so much, as something that, like, is inevitable and natural as anything we've seen in the film. So I guess I'm just wondering,
yeah.
like, the process of finding the right frequency for that.
I mean, that I will completely, I completely looked to the novel for that, and
Yeah.
it's so in there, and everything you just described is in the book. And
Hmm.
I would say that's the beauty and the geniusness of Tove Jansson and her writing. And honestly, like you said, that sort of the uncomfortable question of, will they dig a hole? And then I actually cut the line in the movie, but the line afterwards, which we filmed and is in the book, is grandmother says, "Big enough for all of us,"
Oh
which I
my.
felt like was like such a kind of, like, I was like, oh my God, that's such a, like, sort of intense thing to say to a girl. And so I cut that line out, but I loved that it sort of took a different direction there because you would expect, and I would say a sort of Americanized film would have probably leaned into something more sentimental or something more emotional, that if she said, "When are you going to die?" that she either would ignore it or lie to her or something, and then you would know based on her face, like, oh, she's going to die soon. And the thing that I sort of loved about the scene was she just says, she goes, "Well, never you mind, but soon," which is an intense thing, and but I love that it's not like so precious. It's just real. It's
Mm.
like this character is not going to lie to this girl who's just experienced the death of her mother. She's already like grieving. She knows what the realities of life are now, and that like we are fragile, and so yeah, I think the so much of kind of those ideas and the way that they're executed came from the source material, and I would constantly kind of look back at the novel, not to be like, okay, am I staying so true to the novel, because I wasn't very interested in doing that. I was interested in capturing the feeling of the novel versus like, I think you always get in trouble when you try to like appease everyone who's fans of a book that's well known. Like you're always going to fail. It's a really hard thing to do. And so what I felt like is very true to the adaptation was the feeling that I got when reading it, and I think the feeling that people get when reading it, which is it feels like a memory. And that was kind of always the thing in the back of my mind in filming it, and every visual was, this could be a memory. This could be it could not be this summer. It could be a different moment, and that was what I got from reading the book.
Yeah, and watching the film, I even thought of other films that have dealt in these kinds of themes. I mean, I definitely thought of Miyazaki, which is mentioned in the trailer.
Yeah,
Just the playfulness and even like the styling of Sophia
yeah,
felt like a Miyazaki
yeah,
protagonist,
yeah,
and obviously the appreciation of the wonders of the world and everything. But I also thought of like, Nomadland and some of Chloe Zhao's other work, and
yeah,
even like After Sun, like how Paul Mescal's character, like what he goes through, his internal struggle in that film. There's so much overlap I find with Anders Danielson Lee, you
yeah.
know?
It's so interesting that you say that, because I've now heard that since, and I watched After Sun when I remember exactly where I was. I watched it when I was in Helsinki editing, and
Oh,
I hadn't seen it yet, and people said how good it was, and I watched it, and I would say it was the most inspiring film, because the next day this was quite early on in the edit. The next day I went in and I was like, we got to mess the movie up. We got to blow the movie up.
oh.
and and
Oh
and
my
it
God.
was completely to do with, I not like, oh, I want to edit the movie like After Sun, or
Right.
even like I want to explore the movie like After Sun. It was that she cut out of scenes in a way that she didn't show everything, but it made you feel like, oh, I have my own feeling about what happened or what they didn't show, and I thought that
Hmm.
that was a really bold thing, and it definitely inspired me with whatever my version of that was in cutting the film. And now it's interesting that people have made any sort of connection to it, because in my mind it was like After Sun's completely different movie. There's no connection whatsoever, but it was this sort of inspiring movie for me in the editing process, and so I do think that there is some sort of energy from it that I think made its way into the summer book.
Yeah. I mean, just speaking to that, were there influences by other films? You mentioned Tarkovsky, but like even those, or obviously any maybe childhood memories for yourself or other things outside of the book?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, certainly like Miyazaki films in terms of what you said, this sort of like interesting meditative tone that
Mm.
like is woven in with some narrative drive, but is also like very meditative and slightly kind of surreal. And again, like very memory like. And of course, you know, they go much farther with it with his films, as you can do in that space. But I would say that yeah, that was certainly an influence. I think, like I said, Tarkovsky, in the sense that like I really wanted, like I said, to kind of observe character and like slow down. And a part of like slowing people down is like physically like slowing the camera down. And so I would say like a lot of those like pans with characters where your mind just kind of wanders and you're also watching them and you're observing them, like that certainly was influenced by his films. I watched Petite Maman, or
Oh,
yeah, Petite, yeah,
yep.
and I thought I certainly looked at that film for just kind of capturing the wonder of a kid and sort of how they look at the world, and that was definitely an inspiration. And then, you know, I would say a lot of like the way I work is like I don't like to have this idea that it's like it's this film or this filmmaker and I'm doing like a version of that. I don't like to
Right.
follow rules like that. So I would say like it's not even like film references. Like Tarkovsky, for instance, it's not one film. It's like a shot, or it's a
Mm.
frame, or it's a painting, or it's there. The honestly, the I always start each movie out with a single image, and that sort of dictates what I feel like is the like master look of the film. And I was in Paris. My wife was working there, and I was kind of wandering around one day, and I was trying to like figure out what this movie was. And out of the corner of my eye, I see an image, and I turn and I look, and it was like through a window in a bookshop up on a shelf with like people crossing in front of it. And it was this incredible photograph of this young girl. And I looked at it and it was far away. And I go into the bookstore and I look at the book and it's all in French. And I immediately am like, this is what I want the feel of it to look like. This is what I want the colors to look like. This is what I want the girl to look like. And anyway, it becomes this long story in that the photographer passed away, but her son kind of runs her estate. And I ended up meeting up with him, and I bought a print of this photograph, and it's up on my wall in my house. And that became the sort of like the image that I based everything off of. And it is literally the movie. Like if you look at it, it could be a still from the movie. And so again, it's like these little moments in life that become inspiring, and so it's not one movie or one filmmaker. It's really these kind of collection of images, I would say.
Wow. Well, I think that's a beautiful place to end. Charlie, I had such a great time talking with you. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being a part of Glenn delivering yet another great performance.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kevin. I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. And I highly recommend listeners see the summer book. I think there's a lot of value in it to be found. So thank you again so much.
Thanks so much. Thank you.